This session is about the Open Justice Broker Consortium and some work we've done to implement open source analytics tools. Hopefully that's the session you want to be in. If not, it must be in another room, but that's what we're going to talk about here. There we go. Just a quick introduction. I'm Scott Kame. I'm the executive director, actually, of two nonprofits. The larger one is called Search. It's a membership organization of the states that's been around since the early 70s. And the members are appointed by each governor or executive in that jurisdiction, and tends to be the person in the state government responsible for maintaining criminal justice information and supporting integration of criminal justice information in that state. A few years ago, we were working with a couple of states on implementing some integrated justice applications and information exchanges, and recognize the opportunity to reuse some of that work across states. And so Search spun off and incubated this second nonprofit called the Open Justice Broker Consortium, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But that's kind of the relationship between the two organizations. They're both 501c3 nonprofits headquartered in California. So let me get a sense of you all. How many of you are government folks, work for a government agency? Okay. Is everybody else from a vendor, service provider? Any Code for America folks in here? Brigade folks? Or yeah? Yeah? Indirectly? Okay. And then how many of you would consider yourselves technologists? So maybe not necessarily coders, project managers, database folks. Okay, and everybody else is more on business operational side, policy side? Okay. A little later on in the session, we will get into some, I guess you could call them technical topics about how the information exchanges and the broker work, but I don't think it'll get too far in the weeds. So hopefully won't lose your interest at that point for those of you who aren't technical. So let me do just a brief kind of roadmap of what we're going to do in the session here. There's really three key points I want to make. It's kind of a logical progression. The first is that justice information sharing is critical to solving the problems that are the significant problems that exist in the justice system today. Okay, so really, information sharing has to be part of those solutions. The second point is that it's really not happening as much as it could, and that's largely because it costs too much. And then the third point is getting to a solution to this and fixing this requires that we think outside the box and do things a little differently than we have done traditionally about how we enable information sharing among agencies. Let me take a minute here and just talk about a couple of these terms, because given the other sessions that kind of predominate here at the summit, I think it's important to make sure you understand what I'm talking about. Information sharing is, in the sense that we work with it in the Open Justice Broker Initiative, is largely sharing of information between justice agencies and among justice agencies. It's not so much focused on sharing information between agencies and the public. That's a very important thing to do. And actually, when we talk about the analytics, I'll show you and talk about how you could extend quite simply, actually, what we've done to make it available to make data available to the public, like populating an open data portal or something like that. But that's not traditionally what we've done. What we've focused on is sharing information between law enforcement agencies and prosecutors, or prosecutors and courts, or courts and corrections, and trying to automate that flow through the justice process. So yeah, I think that's a key thing to define here. All right, but I thought it'd be a lot more fun to talk about baseball rather than technology and information sharing. Anybody here a pretty decent baseball fan? Consider yourself knowledgeable about the game and a fan? Okay, just a couple. Well, we'll all learn something then. Okay, so this is a picture of a play about to start, a pitch about to be thrown in baseball. And so baseball fans, what is sort of unique or what's this picture depicting, if you look closely? Yep, there's a left-handed batter. That's a good point. That's sort of the reason for what I'm getting at. But Well, that could be because you have a runner at third here. But what, other than the base runner here, what's interesting about this part of the infield? Yeah, the third baseman's not over there. The third baseman is actually here, usually, because the shortstop's playing where the shortstop usually plays. Second baseman is moved over a little, and the first baseman is pretty much where he usually plays. So given the observation that we have a left-handed batter here, why would the team that's on defense do this? Playing the odds, actually. That's great, yes. This is called the shift, okay, and it's being used a lot more in baseball these days. It was actually used, it's been used since the 20s, and it was sort of first came into sort of the lexicon with Ted Williams. He was one of the best hitters of all time, played in the 40s and 50s, and he would face this all the time because when he didn't hit the ball to the outfield or out of the park, if he hit a ground ball, it almost always went right where those four guys are standing. But other than Ted Williams and a couple other really good hitters, it was sort of considered, I don't know, cheating or not good sportsmanship for defensive teams to do this until the last few years when it's been used a lot more. The playing the odds answer is a really good way to put it. I think the reason that teams are doing this more now is because they have so much better data. A few years ago, Major League Baseball installed cameras in all the corners around the top edge of all the ballparks. And they use those to actually watch every movement the ball makes through the whole game. They measure its speed, velocity, trajectory, where it lands, where it bounces, when it stops rolling, the speed while it's rolling, all that stuff. And there's also folks that Major League Baseball pays to be in the stadium to record what happens on every play. And Major League Baseball made a really good decision, I think, to actually release all that data to the public. It's called PitchFX is the system. If you Google about that, you can find it. If you're interested in downloading lots of pitch-by-pitch, play-by-play baseball data and messing around with it, it's an extremely rich, interesting data set. But it's also available to all the teams, right? And there's not a major league team out there now that doesn't have an analytics department, because if they didn't, they wouldn't be winning very much. So it allows them to produce analyses like this. This is what's called a spray chart. Bryce Harper, anybody know who Bryce Harper is? Yeah, left-handed batter, plays for the Washington Nationals. Actually, as of last week, he had the highest batting average of any left-handed player in baseball, so he's a really, really good player. I've filtered out of this. There's a site, baseballsavant.com, that gives you access to the PitchFX data. Basically, you can build queries. And I filtered out most of his hits are out here. This is a small percentage of his hits because he's so good. But the ones that he does hit on the ground, they're all clustered right here, right? So what do you think Bryce Harper faces every time he gets up? He faces the shift. So the reason teams are doing this is because they have the data to do so. We're in Oakland, so it would be wrong not to mention Billy Beane. And he was quoted last year as saying he thinks within a few years there's actually going to be an IT manager or a data manager sitting in the dugout. Right now, if you watch coverage of baseball on TV, usually the manager is sitting in some kind of seat near the edge of the dugout, and most of them have had a desk installed there. And if you look, they have reams of charts. A lot of them use iPads and laptops to track data as the game's going on. They're actually not allowed to use data from the game they're playing in, but they get access to up to the last game of their own players and the opponent, and they use it to make decisions. And increasingly, like I said, teams that haven't figured out how to do this don't perform very well. And it's also used, in addition to those tactical decisions, for strategic decisions. When teams think about what they're going to do in the draft, when they think about what trades they're going to make every July, they use data increasingly to make those decisions. They have models. that they feed the data into. They can run scenarios and that sort of thing, simulations, and that's really how they make most of their decisions. So, friend and colleague Ann Milgram from the Arnold Foundation did a TED Talk a year or so ago. That's really good. I would recommend you look at it. And the title of the talk is Moneyball and Criminal Justice. And she drew this analogy of what we could do if we just gave our justice practitioners the same type of data that was made famous in the Moneyball book and movie about Billy Beane and making decisions about baseball using data. The key question is, baseball teams get to make these tactical and strategic decisions using data. Why can't our judges, law enforcement officers, prosecutors, corrections folks, community corrections officers have access to the same tools? All right, we're done talking about baseball now. So you might argue, though, are there really problems in the justice system? Why do we, I may grant you that information sharing is important, but why should we even be thinking about solving a problem at all? Because there really isn't one. If you measure that based on crime rates, that might be a conclusion you reach. In the last decade, this is basically the picture. This is what gets reported in the newspaper, because every year the FBI releases the annual crime data, and the rates have been falling, and falling considerably. But I think, and I would argue, that that actually obscures some of the real problems that we have that really demand our attention. So I call these the big four, and they're the things that when we work with justice agencies around the country, we continuously see. It's what the National Justice Associations are working on and thinking about. It's where grant funding is being directed. So these are important problems. Recidivism, when people go through the justice system, more often than not, they tend to come back. And that not only is not good for them, their families, and their communities, but it costs a lot of money. A second problem, I think community relations is a fairly obvious one. After the last couple of years with events like what happened in Ferguson and other officer-involved shootings, police departments across the country are focused on improving their engagement with and relationships with their communities, the cities they serve, the counties they serve, and especially communities of color. The whole policing data initiative that the White House has launched, there have been a couple sessions on that here, is aimed to encourage that kind of engagement and improvement of relations with communities. Safety of our public officials, law enforcement officers, prosecutors, judges, there are a lot of them that are still put in more danger every day than they need to be. They understand the job comes with a certain amount of risk, but we could do better to keep them safe. And finally, efficiency and effectiveness. Those of you who are in government, which was the vast majority of you, I'm guessing that for the most part, you don't have extra money laying around that you can just, you have the freedom to spend whatever you want on whatever you want. Budgets are still not fully recovered from the Great Recession, especially at the local government level and the state government level. So there's constant pressure, I think, for justice agencies to become more efficient and effective, to do their job better. So I would argue that each of these four problems are significant problems, and they all have an information sharing component. So here are some examples. In the pretrial phase of justice, so this is someone's been arrested and the case is going to go to trial, but it hasn't occurred yet. So there's the issue of what to do with this defendant while they're awaiting trial. And it's not as simple as, well, are they released on bail or do they remain in detention, in jail? Increasingly, jurisdictions are realizing, and prosecutors are realizing, that jail is often not the best place for nonviolent offenders. And so there are efforts to identify the risks of reoffending, before trial, and the needs, the medical needs, mental health, programming needs, substance abuse needs, counseling, these kinds of things that can help this person with the underlying problem that caused the commission of a crime. And that is all about information sharing. There are assessment tools that courts and prosecutors use to assess these things, but they require the collection of data. And if you think about interviewing a person that may have mental health issues or other things going on in their life, substance abuse problems, health problems, interviewing them is an important component of, but can't be the only way of collecting data. And the justice system has generally a great deal of information about people that we're dealing with, but we're not really using it as much. So we're sub-optimizing those decisions. We're putting people in jail that not only unnecessarily uses jail bed space, but is also not the best way of preventing that person from committing a new crime once they go through the process. Reentry programs at the other end of the process, after someone has spent time in prison, if that was the nature of their sentence, they're going to be coming back into the community. While they were in prison, there's typically a host of programs that they go through, training that they've received, healthcare that they've received, those kinds of things. And when they go out into the community, they're expected to continue that treatment. It's often a condition of their release. But if we don't provide the service providers in the community with the information about what they received, what happened with them while they were incarcerated, there's a big gap there. And oftentimes information gets dropped and that person, again, gets suboptimal treatment. Community policing, making data available to the public is an information sharing problem. The reason a lot of police departments don't do this is because it's too costly. Doing custom extracts out of police record systems, which are generally proprietary, is often very expensive and places a lot of demand on IT staff for resources that just don't exist. Warrants. Would anybody believe that when a local police officer does a traffic stop and they get the license and they run an NCIC check, which is, their dispatcher basically uses a system to query an FBI database for information about that person to see if they're wanted or what their criminal history is. 75% of the warrants that are issued in this country, so that's protection orders, warrants for someone's arrest, if they're wanted in connection with a crime, 75% of those warrants are not in the FBI's database. Actually, most of them never leave the local community. So if the person that's been stopped happens to be from that community, it's likely the officer will, that search, that query that the dispatcher is doing will return caution to the officer to be careful with this person. If they're from outside the community, there's very little chance that those warrants will be in that return. So back to officer safety, we're placing that person at greater risk than they need to be because we've failed to share information across the country. In most states, the police reports from one agency are not available electronically to officers even in the next town over. Those systems are typically not integrated. So again, we're forcing police officers to operate in an environment where they don't have all the relevant information. And sometimes, in fact, can even lead them to handle a case and handle a situation differently to the disadvantage of the citizen than they would have otherwise. And then finally, automation is an information sharing gap as well. A lot of prosecutors' offices around the country devote a lot of clerical resources to re-entering data that's been entered electronically at the police department already. A lot of probation officers, they're interested in knowing if the people that they're supervising have been arrested or had contact with law enforcement. And so a lot of county probation offices, city probation offices actually assign an officer maybe on a weekly rotating basis to go down to the jail, to go down to the courthouse every morning and scan the roster of people who were arrested last night to see if any of their supervised individuals are on the list. So that's wasting or spending, many, many hours of probation officer time doing something that could easily be handled by an electronic information exchange. So hopefully I've made the case here that we have some problems in the justice community. It's not all like what you see on Hawaii Five-0 or NCIS, where we can just have these giant screens with every possible piece of information. It's not at all like that, and it's actually contributing to some of the problems that we see that aren't necessarily reflected in falling crime rates. Okay, so why isn't it like you see on NCIS? Why is it so hard to share? Well, if you think about it, and this can apply at the city level, the county level, the state level, and it's really a mess nationally. But you have justice agencies, not all of them are depicted here, but you get the idea. There's multiple agencies, and they're independent with the judiciary. They're even in a separate branch of government. So the executive or even the legislature has limits on what they can tell the judiciary to do. Oftentimes you have a separately elected sheriff, a separately elected prosecutor, and in some communities those folks feel empowered pretty much to do whatever they want because they've been elected. So a lot of independence there. These agencies often buy systems from vendors that are quite proprietary. They're not intended really to share information, and in fact, and I'm not saying this is true of all vendors, but many of them have in their business model not to make data available outside of the system. That's changing a bit. More of them are sort of seeing the business advantage to doing that, but many of them do not. The way these systems are funded is often quite fragmented. There are federal grants that can only be used by law enforcement agencies or only be used by drug courts and not other kinds of courts. And so you wind up getting an infusion of money to invest in a system, and the spending of that grant results in a very nice system to solve that one problem, but it doesn't really necessarily look at the justice system as a whole. And so you get some fragmentation there. The software tools that are sort of the best in class for solving that kind of problem tend to be pretty expensive, or at least they did until a couple of years ago. And it's kind of complex to set up. In a larger county, a Los Angeles County, or even Alameda here in Oakland, there may be a large enough IT staff that you can afford to have someone who specializes in system integration. In Thurston County, Washington, the county where I live, of about 200,000 people, no way. The IT staff is focused on keeping the email servers up and the website up, and maybe a small open data effort and supporting the basic functions of government. There's not enough resources to have someone specialize in enterprise integration. And then if you think about what happens when you scale from the county level to the state level, there's even states with not that many counties have at least a dozen or so. So you have these little pockets of information sharing gaps, and then it gets even worse as you try to integrate those integrated systems across the state, and then nationally it's just kind of mind-blowing. So in addition to it being complex, there's often not enough reuse going on across those jurisdictions. So you may have a law enforcement agency in one county that has the same exact record system as the county over here, and this year this agency has the vendor build an interface here, and maybe this county doesn't even know that they did that, or the licensing of the software doesn't allow them to reuse that component. So something that was built once has to be built again at the same cost. So if you think about the cost overall of sharing information across a state, it's much larger than it needs to be. So that's kind of point two. We've got these problems in the justice system. They could be solved at least in part or helped by better information sharing. But the information sharing is not happening because it costs too much. There's not enough reuse. It takes resources that a lot of jurisdictions just don't have. So the third point and kind of the crux of this is we would argue that to solve this problem and kind of get out of this trap, it requires kind of a new way of thinking about supporting this with software and how to build and acquire these the technical capabilities to make this happen. And that's kind of the genesis of the Open Justice Broker. And I'll talk a little bit about the background of that in a minute. But here's sort of, in an information flow sense, how the OJB platform works. It's based on the notion of events that happen. Okay, so if you think about the daily operation of the justice system, law enforcement officers are interacting with citizens, arresting some of them. If it's an arrest that requires booking, they go to the county jail and they're booked and detained in jail. The next morning there's an arraignment event where the prosecutor formally files charges in court. After a process, the court adjudicates the case, and let's say it results in a conviction and a sentence, perhaps to county probation. So the probation officer then meets with that offender and intakes them into their supervision, and so on. There's a whole bunch of events that happen throughout a person's interaction with the justice system. So in this case, I've just used an example of an arrest occurring, and the next step in the process is the prosecutor reviews the police report and the circumstances of the arrest and the evidence and all that, and decides whether to file charges. But if you think about it, there's all kinds of other things that are triggered by an arrest. Yes, the prosecution needs to decide on charges, but if the person's booked, an hour from now they're going to wind up or they're going to arrive at county jail, which in most counties, if this is a municipal police department, the jail is generally run by the county sheriff. So it's two completely separate police law enforcement agencies, right? So the information that was captured in this agency's system is not automatically available here. In some jurisdictions, they share a system, but in many they don't. Also, maybe this person who's arrested is already a probationer. So wouldn't that person's probation officer like to know that, hey, we just encountered this person last night doing X, Y, Z, and we've arrested them? So you may want to intervene earlier and be part of the handling of this case, and not wait 3 weeks or a month before you find out that they've been detained. One thing we've added recently, and it's the analytics part of the presentation here that we'll talk about in a bit, is we can take these events as they're being reported and store them in a database for analytics purposes. And by analytics, I mean sort of aggregate assessment of performance measures across the justice system. What is our recidivism rate in our county? What is the demographic breakdown of the people who are being arrested for what types of crimes? Those kinds of measures. It's generally important when building an analytics database like this to take the personally identifiable information out, and we certainly do that in the OJB effort. We don't want this becoming a sort of database of people's private information. But yet the prosecution certainly needs that information in order to prepare their charging documents. So one of the things you can do in processing the events is strip out certain types of information that shouldn't go on to the next process. So kind of at a business level, we've designed software to kind of implement this idea that events occur, they get reported to a central entity that handles them, and then there's business logic and rules that determines what happens with that event after that. Oops. And one of the unique things we do with the OJB, and there are commercial products that do this certainly, none that are really focused in the justice space specifically. But everything we do is open source. The OJBC is a nonprofit, like I said. We're not in this to make money. We're in this to solve those justice information sharing problems. So when we develop these interfaces here, we make them available under an open source license. This process actually is pretty much the same in every county. There may be small variations, but you can go to any county in the country, and it's the same kind of basic processes. So there's a lot of this, the rules and such that happen in the center that can be reused. So we make all that available under an open source license as well. So this is hoping to get around that problem where interfaces are built in one jurisdiction, and then the next jurisdiction has to pay again to build the same thing. Okay, so just a quick little bit of background here. Oh, and by the way, if you have any questions or comments or whatever, just interrupt. Yeah. It can be deployed anywhere, really. The software we're using is sort of agnostic to where it gets deployed. But logically thinking about it, it's typically housed, at least logically, in a place that is central to the participating agencies. So if it's a statewide justice integration project, we often put that in the state capital, or if it's in the cloud, it's sort of maintained and owned and controlled by a state agency on behalf of everyone who's sharing. If it's in county, it might be in the county seat and county IT, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Scott,
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier on that 75% of warrants don't get to the FBI.
Right.
Does this approach help? Is there an arm to this that helps automate it to the FBI?
Well, no, unfortunately not. A lot of the reason for that is because of the rules the FBI has for submitting warrants. And a lot of local agencies just don't collect enough of the data to satisfy their rules. And that's not going to change anytime soon. But what this can do is, if you implement this at the state level, at least it can make the warrants, all the warrants in the state, available, because typically the courts keep a pretty good record of that locally, and in many states there's sort of a central state repository of warrants, and at least they'd be available there. So it wouldn't be perfect, but it's better than what we have. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about how this started up. So we're working in a couple of states, Maine and Vermont, or Maine and Hawaii in particular, and implementing the kind of the picture you just saw. And as we started building those interfaces and the middleware in the middle, we recognized that a lot of what we were doing in Maine, Hawaii wanted to do 6 months later. And oh, by the way, what we built in Hawaii, Maine said, well, we could use that too. We had sort of learned from experience that you can't just put code online and expect people to reuse it. You sort of have to plan for that, and you have to kind of convince or you have to implement sort of the same architecture, otherwise things don't really fit together. So in order to kind of add some structure and some organization to that sharing, we got together with the two states and decided to form this consortium. It's a separate nonprofit, an entity that could sort of provide that structure. Also, both states were really interested in having, in sharing staff resources, because they just didn't have the ability to do that with their internal IT, IT organizations. So the consortium became this nonprofit organization that sort of manages the evolution of this platform as it grows and provides shared staff resources to the members. After another year and a half or so, the state of Vermont decided to join and contributed some things, and also reused a lot of what had been done in Maine and Hawaii. And then recently we've added Michigan as the fourth member. And we're pretty close to adding a couple more members here later this year. So it's grown slowly because it's a new concept and sort of hard for folks to grasp, I think, sometimes, or sort of picture how it would work. But it's proving pretty effective in solving some of those problems, especially the cost issue. Earlier this year, the board of the consortium made the decision to release everything under an open source license. Prior to that, the source code was shared among the members, but not with anyone else. And we just determined that it was better to fulfill our mission by making that available. And also, even if a jurisdiction didn't want to join, they could at least get the benefit of the code. And the license we use, the open source license that we use, compels anyone who creates a derivative work to contribute those changes back to the code base. So it sort of incentivizes and in fact legally requires those contributions so that we can reuse what folks are doing. So there's, I actually put on the table in the back some information that we've had at our table in the tech fair, but it has contact information and some other information that I'm not going to get into here. But if you're interested in learning a little more about that and some contact information, it's on the table back there. Okay, so let's focus in now on analytics, since that was kind of the advertised purpose. So the Open Justice Broker platform is really about enabling any kind of sharing in the justice community. Analytics is just one application that we've built with it. But this is basically how it works. So as I mentioned, everything's based on these events occurring. So an event occurs in an agency. It gets reported in a standard format to this, you can think of it like a messaging hub. And the logic in the messaging hub can be set up to say, oh, this is an event that we want to persist for analytical purposes. So if it's one of those events, it goes down a path that strips out the PII, and we've figured out how to configure an algorithm that converts some number of attributes of the person. And in our implementation of this in Vermont, we're using first name, last name, date of birth, and social security number if it exists, which it typically doesn't in these data sources, but if it's there, we'll use it. And it turns that into just a hash that if you get a hold of this hash, there's no way to tell that this belongs to this person. So if, God forbid, this database was compromised, yes, somebody, the attacker would be able to run lots of nice analytics and stuff, but would not be able to get any personally identifiable information. There's no way to reverse engineer this back to that. Okay, so we populate a big database of events in real time as they occur. And then typically the data in here needs some cleaning and formatting and structuring and such. If you've ever dealt with operational data, especially from law enforcement agencies, it's often kind of dirty. Things misspelled. If the source system doesn't use a drop-down for one thing or another, you can wind up miscategorizing things or whatever. So this was actually the bulk of the effort in our project in Vermont, developing that. And it would be the bulk of effort in implementing this in any jurisdiction, kind of figuring out what the source data look like and cleaning them up. This runs on a daily basis in Vermont. It could be set up to run on any periodic frequency. In Vermont, the desire was to do it daily, and the results wind up in an analytics database. You could think of it as a data warehouse, a data mart, that kind of thing. And then we've identified and implemented some open source analytics tools that provide dashboarding and ad hoc query capabilities, and also integrated a single sign-on capability that's also part of the Open Justice Broker platform. Based on some national justice community standards. And the users use the tools to do the analytics. So this is kind of the suite of open source software that we're using to enable the analytics. The real workhorse of it is Pentaho, which is a suite of it's sort of a plug-in container environment, really, that provides some infrastructure for supporting analytics components. And then there are lots of both commercial and open source plugins that you just install into Pentaho to do various things. There are ad hoc query components, several of them. There are different components to do dashboarding, that sort of thing. All of our, well, actually, let me go this way. So Saiku is the plugin that actually does the ad hoc querying piece. So it's sort of makes all of your measures and dimensions available, and you just drag and drop them onto a palette, and it builds a query for you. And it's using some community OLAP standards, online analytical processing standards, under the hood for how to do that. This all sits on a MySQL database, but it could be any database. This is all Java-based, by the way, so it runs equally well on Windows, on Linux, on Macs. And we, in fact, actually run it on all three of those platforms. If you happen to stop by our table in the tech fair, we were doing demos on Macs, but in Vermont, this runs on Windows Server, so it just seamlessly works. So this could be any relational database, SQL Server, MySQL, Postgres, Oracle. And there's the schema that I was talking about, the community standard for defining OLAP queries, sits right in here on top of MySQL. So it sort of maps the relational structure to kind of a data warehousey measures and dimensions kind of structure. And that's what the tools in Pentaho like to use. The whole loading process and some advanced analytics are done with the R platform. I'm just curious, how many are using R for anything in here? Okay, so we have some. All right. It's pretty much the state of the art, I think. 20 years ago, you'd be using SAS or something like that for this, or writing it in C or something crazy like that. But R has really become kind of the, I would say, de facto standard for data science stuff, both manipulating and kind of cleaning up and munching data, as well as doing statistical analyses and things. Thank you. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about what we did in Vermont here, then I'm going to show you some screenshots, and then we can take questions or discussion. Every state at the state government level has a identified, nominated by the governor, entity that the Department of Justice uses as a contact point for statistical analysis purposes. The Bureau of Justice Statistics at DOJ actually gives grants on an annual basis to that entity to use for developing research and statistics in justice. They're called the Statistical Analysis Centers. There's actually an organization, an association that represents them called JRSA, the Justice Research and Statistics Association. So if you want to know who that is in your state, go to JRSA. There's information there. They also do all kinds of webinars on research and statistics and justice that you might be interested in. So anyway, the Crime Research Group is that entity in Vermont. And then we also worked with the state police, the Department of Public Safety there. The events that we worked with are law enforcement incidents and arrests, dispositions from the courts. So that's when the courts adjudicate a case and make a final decision on it. There's an extract that comes from the courts that has that information in it, sentence information, what the final adjudicated charge was, all that sort of thing. And then intakes into a pretrial services program that they had in Vermont. This is all to support analysis in 3 priority business areas that are kind of priorities in Vermont right now. One, the sheriffs and police chiefs there have been struggling with understanding really across the state what is driving law enforcement usage. What are police agencies spending their time doing? And they had a sense that it wasn't really on violent crimes and such, that it was mostly on kind of quality of life and nuisance type things. So they wanted to measure that. The governor's big initiative in Vermont, as it is in many rural states, is drug crime. That's sort of his signature public safety initiative. So they wanted some measures around that. And then they've started up this statewide pretrial services program in Vermont, and they wanted measures that can sort of assess the implementation of that. To do that, we did 3 dashboards in each of those 3 areas. There are 5 sort of cubes. If you're familiar with data warehousing and OLAP, a cube is sort of a combination of measures and dimensions that you can use for analysis. If you think about dimensions like demographic variables or time or geographic variables, if you think about making a multidimensional structure out of those, you have cells that are the sort of the crosstab or the breakdown of counts or averages or whatever in that cell. So that's kind of where the term cube comes from. The part of the project is defining a schema that defines those cubes on top of the relational database. So we have 5 of those. And then there's an ability to take the analytical database and do extracts out of it into R data sets for the sort of hardcore statistician types to do analyses in R. Okay, so I'm going to show you some screenshots. This is all fake data. As you can imagine, some of the data in here are fairly sensitive. If you get small towns in Vermont and start breaking it down by demographics, pretty soon you get to identifying things that could easily be taken out of context. So their policy and rules around usage of the system are that it's for internal justice system use. But to test it and to develop it and build it and do demos, we've generated some random data in the analytics database. So this is really just to give you a flavor of what the Pentaho dashboarding capability is like. The This is, you know, kind of bar charts, line charts, heat grids, those kind of things you're used to in Tableau and tools like that. It's all JavaScript based, based on Bootstrap. If you're a developer, that probably means something to you. And it just, in real time, pulls data out of the analytics database using a fairly simple to define template. So that's one. This is the dashboard that analyzes drug crimes. You can see here that there are some drop downs, and this is so much better if I can do a demo, but I couldn't here. There's drop downs to allow some customization of these. You know, the idea of a dashboard is you don't want it to be like an app that somebody has to use. This is an executive coming in and looking at this and wanting just a quick picture without having to futz with a lot of controls. But you often want a little bit of ability for the user to customize and pick certain dimensions to look at and whatnot. And so the drop downs provide that capability. And there are similar controls like radio buttons and sliders and stuff. But to give you a sense of it, this is a plot of drug arrests over time by the type of drugs. So you've got different drug types here, plotted by month. A bar chart here to capture the counts of ready cash crimes, which are crimes that people commit in order to get money to buy drugs. Recidivism levels. Recidivism is one of the most interesting topics in justice statistics because there's about 100 different ways to measure it. And jurisdictions have traditionally had trouble putting the data together to allow measurement of it because you have to be able to track an individual over time. That was one of the cool things about that hash we were able to create is it's consistent over time. You just feed the same attributes in, and it actually does fuzzy searching and first name substitution. So if you have Frank and Franklin or Rob, Bob, and Robert, if the rest of the stuff matches, that's counted as the same person instead of just doing a straight string match. So that that hash actually produced more accurate tracking of arrests for the same person and dispositions for the same person over time than Vermont had been able to do with their traditional data sources. And then this is just another dashboard for the pretrial services. This gives you an idea. This is a little hard to see because it's kind of cut off over here, but this is the Saiku query tool. And this is the list of dimensions in this cube, which is I just happened to pick the crime rate cube for this screenshot. But there's measures like crime rate per 1,000, arrest count, population count, and then all the dimensions against which you can run the statistics. And I just happened to pick sex and age by different drug types and the crime rate per 1,000. So what this table shows in the dummy data, so don't take a picture of this and say, try to connect this to some jurisdiction because there is no jurisdiction. It's randomly generated. But you know, in the dummy data, 15 to 19-year-old males, there were 3.7 arrests per 1,000 for cocaine in the time period that this was, which is the whole data set, which I think is just 1 year of randomly generated data. But the point is not the numbers because they're fake, but the power of this for a user to be able to just drag and drop these dimensions into a palette and instantly produce a table like that. And then with another click of the button, which you can't see because it's off the screen here, but you can turn those tables into charts and graphs of various types. I happen to pick the pie chart, which is interesting because I hate pie charts. I don't know why I did that, but there's bar charts and line charts and heat grids and all that kind of stuff that you can just click through. So if you're trying to just get a quick visual sense of the data, it's pretty easy to do that. All right, so that's one innovative approach that sort of hasn't been tried before. And there's really two key things about it: using open source software and creating a structure and a way for jurisdictions to share software across jurisdictional boundaries through kind of a nonprofit organization. That's the innovative approach we're trying. There are certainly others out there to solve these problems, but I hope that's been interesting to you. I posed some discussion questions, but what questions do you guys have, or what would you like to talk about in our last few minutes here? Yeah.
So for the CAD softwares that don't allow releasing data very easily, have you had any approaches with them that have worked, or would you have any suggestions for cities that are stuck with that?
Yeah, the first thing I do is if you just ask like the CIO or the IT manager of the police agency, does the RMS system expose the data? Often the first answer you'll get is no, or it's really cumbersome. Then I say, okay, do you have anybody in the department that uses crystal reports to produce information? And about 2/3 of the time, the answer is, oh yeah, it's, Mary in our analysis program, you can go talk to her. And Mary has on her computer about 5,000 crystal reports that she's created by painstakingly figuring out the proprietary structure of the database. And the first thing we ask of Mary is, if we take you to lunch, would you give us a copy of all the queries in your crystal reports report files? And typically we can do a pretty good job of figuring out how to get the key stuff, because she's already been working on the stuff that's going to be the high priority stuff anyway. That typically works. Oftentimes the vendor will give the customer like an ER diagram of the database, and we'll take that and work with it. We've probably built interfaces to 15 or so proprietary systems across the 4 states, and we've never had a situation where we couldn't figure it out.
And those are part of the solution. You shared those interfaces.
Yeah, they're available. Some of them aren't. A couple of them we did have to sign an NDA with the vendor, and so we're not allowed to make those open source. Hopefully, at some point, the vendor will see the light. But most of them are, in the GitHub repository. And the address for that is, well, if you just do OJBC, GitHub/OJBC, you'll find it, but it's also on the back of the little brochure. Yeah.
In your work in different jurisdictions, have you come across or incorporating human service data? So as you talk about, focus on recidivism, we're looking at substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, integrating traditional criminal justice data with human services data?
Yes, we have. So not in an analytics context, but in the automation work that we do, we've actually integrated with external healthcare providers for either allowing a jail, when they see this person, with their consent, to go to their healthcare provider's system and pull the data back. And then we've also built a couple of exchanges for reentry when folks are leaving prison or jail, to extract their health information, again with their consent, and send that to healthcare providers in that community. I'm not sure. Yeah, all that should be available in the open source repository out there. So it's been more limited than the strictly internal justice exchanges, but I think that's going to be a growing area for us. Yeah. Yeah.
One day potentially replace the NCIC? Because it was alarming that you said that you query the NCIC and you won't get 75% of the warrants.
Yeah.
If people use this instead, could that potentially serve as a better database?
I don't dare to dream that big. Certainly, I think an architecture like this could support something like that nationally. I don't envision the FBI adopting this necessarily. But like I said in answering the question earlier, I think it can be more useful at the state level. For instance, all the bench warrants in Hawaii are available through a federated query service that we have in the platform. So for folks in Hawaii, there's a good portion of those bench warrants that have been issued in Hawaii that aren't in NCIC for whatever reason. But they're all available through that system for folks in Hawaii to use. So I would say probably not in any of our lifetimes, but we can make marginal improvements at the state level. Yeah.
What was that recipe for success in actually implementing? So you said that you had shared resources, but what was what actually made it happen in the states that you were able to make it work?
To make which happen?
Like the implementation of the software and the code and all of
Well, it was solving some identified problems, and the states had brought us in to actually work on projects that they had in their pipeline. And I assume in each of the states there's some level of collaborative governance process over this. So there's a committee or a council or a working group that has representatives from all of the agencies and some local representation too. And that group kind of sets priorities for what the state is working on, information sharing wise. And we just work on whatever those priorities happen to be. So if you meant sort of how did they get the impetus to and the motivation to even do anything, that's kind of where it bubbled up from. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So what was the biggest impediment? Why would not all states do this?
Good question. I think there's, well, believe it or not, I think there are still a good number of states that aren't convinced there's a problem that statewide information sharing could solve. On the law enforcement side, there's actually pretty good integration of arrest data and certainly the FBI data through mechanisms that have been in place for years. So if you ask, if you ask folks in the state, they may think that they're sort of already doing as much as they can or as much as they need to do. So I think that's part of it. They may not recognize there's a problem. I think there is still some concern among IT leaders about implementing open source. We actually put together a little document. I brought some copies on the table there about busting some myths about open source in government. And so we just took kind of the top 5 things we've heard CIOs say about why they can't implement open source and tried to offer a counter explanation. But it's things like, a perception that most open source projects are, teenagers doing it in their parents' garage at night and things like that, not realizing that all the tools we're using here have been built by big software companies like Google and Apple and even Microsoft's contributing to open source projects now. So it's just sort of changing that perception about open source. Another big question is about support. And that's kind of another reason why we started the consortium is it's sort of like a Red Hat model where, the Linux operating system is open source. But if I'm a CIO, I'm probably going to be implementing Fedora or Red Hat or, some distribution that has a company to support it. We're trying to be that entity for these organizations to allow them to be comfortable implementing the open source tools. But we found that with some public sector CIOs, that's a harder sell than you might think. So those are 2 answers, I guess. Some of the technology in the early days until we developed expertise with it was a little challenging. These are very mature open source projects, but like many, some of the features and functions aren't necessarily easily understood. But we've gotten way over that hump now, and our team of developers, we don't really run into anything that's a surprise anymore. Other questions? Yeah.
We keep talking about the 4 states, but is search willing to take this at the county level? Because at the county level, it's embarrassing how we don't even share with our cities, right?
Yeah.
So is search only focused on the states? Or
No.
And it's open source, so we can do it ourselves, but you're there to help counties as well.
Yeah, we just started at the state level because that's kind of it was a grassroots thing, and that's where the grass was growing. But now we're in a position where we've got stability, we've got something we know works, and that was part of the reason why we were interested in coming here. And I was delighted to have the chance to do this presentation because it's really county and city government where we think this could provide a lot of value. I'd like to get to the point where that small, maybe ex-urban or rural county of 100,000 people could actually implement this at very low cost and very low operating cost and actually do things that they could never do any other way. That's kind of our long-term vision for this, but we had to start somewhere. Yeah. We're 3 minutes over, but anyone who wants to continue talking or asking questions, I'm happy to stay. Anything else? Yeah.
I just want to say, I served as CIO of Puerto Rico, so I hosted the search people down
Oh, yeah,
free of
Giancarlo.
charge was, we gave programs on NEEM, and we managed to train a couple of providers, suppliers to learn that structure so that we would implement programs. So I mean, it was free. You guys were just helping me out, and I thought it was great. So just wanted to let you know that I know you guys and I support you, and I thought you were doing a great job.
Thank you. That's very kind.
And
Appreciate it.
congratulations on your award.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that was nice recognition. Anything else? All right, I think there's a reception down in the tech fair room, so that's probably your next stop. And thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.